Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ruba Katrib, curator at PS1, and I also organize the exhibition Niki de Saint Phalle, Structures for Life, which is currently on view at the museum. And I just want to take a quick moment before we start, since we don't have so many public occasions these days, to thank everyone who helped make this exhibition possible, including the amazing team at PS1 and those who generously supported the exhibition, which includes La Prairie, Switzerland, the Contemporary Arts Council of the Museum of Modern Art, Lisa Stolt-Nielsen, MoMA's Wallace Annenberg Fund for Innovation in Contemporary Art through the Annenberg Foundation, Keith Haring Foundation, the Deborah Buck Foundation, and the Blue Rider Group at Morgan Stanley. Thank you. And I'm so pleased to have this occasion this evening to dig a little bit deeper into Niki de Saint Phalle's work on tarot. Primarily her life's work, Tarot Garden, which features prominently in the exhibition through models, photography, and archival video. The exhibition focuses on her public works, and Tarot Garden comprises the subject of Niki de Saint Phalle's most ambitious and long-term project. It's a massive sculpture park and garden that she built in Italy from 1979 to 2002 when she passed away. It opened to the public in 1998, and it's open to this day through the spring to fall season. So this garden was Niki de Saint Phalle's dream, which was inspired when she visited Gaudi's Park Güell in 1955 in Barcelona. And this dream was that she wanted to create a new matriarchal society, a place where people can, quote, have a new kind of life to just be free. And she wanted to create a built environment that is in harmony with nature, which she modeled through several projects that are on view in the exhibition, but is perhaps best experienced and understood through Tarot Garden. And I'm very honored and excited to have two people who are deeply connected to the work that Niki has done and the subject of tarot, Susan Aberth and Rachel Pollack, here to unpack this project a bit more, but also to talk about tarot more generally, its history and its role in art history. So let me introduce our two guests this evening, Rachel Pollack, who is the author of 46 books, including 2 award-winning novels, Unquenchable Fire and Godmother Night. She's written a series of books about tarot cards known around the world, a book of poetry, and she also designed and drew her own tarot deck, the Shining Tribe Tarot. And with the artist Robert Place, she has created 2 more decks, the Burning Serpent Oracle and the Raziel Tarot. She's taught and lectured on 4 continents, and for 11 years, she has taught in Goddard's College's MFA writing program. And Rachel lives in New York's Hudson Valley. And I actually learned about Rachel's work through many artist friends who see her regularly, and was fortunate to have a reading with her before the pandemic. Additionally, Rachel knew Niki de Saint Phalle and consulted with her on the garden. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. Susan Aberth is the Edith C. Blum Professor in the Art History and Visual Cultural Program at Bard College. Her publications include The Tarot of Leonora Carrington, which just came out and was co-authored with the Mexican curator Terry Arc. She's written Leonora Carrington, Surrealism, Alchemy, and Art. And she's contributed to books such as Surrealism and Magic, forthcoming through the Guggenheim Venice, Not Without My Ghosts, contributed to the catalog for the Agnes Pelton show that was at the Phoenix Art Museum and just came to the Whitney Museum of American Art. She's contributed to Surrealism, Occultism, and Politics in Search of the Marvelous, and Leonora Carrington, Cuentos Magicos, and Leonora Carrington and the International Avant-Garde. She's a contributor also to the Journal of Surrealism of the Americas, Abraxas, International Journal of Esoteric Studies, and Black Mirror. And it's really fortunate that Susan has just written this amazing book on Leonora Carrington's recently discovered tarot deck, which I have a copy here. And it was really thrilling to learn that this book was forthcoming as the Niki de Saint Phalle show was about to open. So a really great convergence, and we'll get into that a little bit more today. So before we kick off the conversation, I just wanted to start with a short clip from a documentary on Niki de Saint Phalle, directed by Peter Shimoni. And this is like the start of the documentary, but it's just a great way to see images of the garden in situ, which is a site-specific project. You have to go to Italy to see this and experience it, as well as hear a little bit about to hear Niki de Saint Phalle speak a little bit more about her interest in tarot in her own words. So, Chris, if you could play the video, please. Thank you.
I knew that this was what I was meant to do. It wasn't even my choice, it was my destiny. This garden was based on the tarot pack. Now, what is the tarot? Is it just cards? There's a mystery involving these cards. They're linked to the Kabbalah. It's the same alphabet. Some people think that these cards came from Moses and were brought over from Egypt, and that they were the secret meanings in these cards contain the secret meanings of the knowledge of the Egyptian priests, that they were transmitted pictorially. I identified with one of the cards, the Fool. The Fool is the one who goes, nose in the air. He represents man, searching for his spiritual identity. And this is what I was doing this card.
Thank you. So yeah, just a taste of what the tarot garden looks like. And also it's such, from night to morning, sunrise. Most visitors see it in the day, which is fantastic, but also at night it's quite beautiful because there's all these lights that turn on in the various structures. But I guess just to start, Susan, I think we should start with Lenora Carrington and your book and just talking a little bit about her use of the tarot. And then if you and Rachel could talk a little bit about the history of the tarot and its relationship to art practice. So I know you have a presentation to kick us off with.
Why don't you just let me share the screen? Well, I had known Leonora Carrington for a very long time, and we had spoken for hundreds of hours, and I knew that she was interested in the tarot, and in a work like this, which is playing tarot, that was done in the 1990s. She was quite elderly by that time, and she was still very interested in it. And although we spoke often, like I said, about various esoteric things. It was only in 2018 that the shocking thing happened. My co-author of the book, Dede Arc, who is a curator in Mexico City, was doing a large retrospective exhibition, Magical Tales, to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Leonora's birth. And to her shock, while doing work for the exhibition, she found the major arcana done by Leonora. We had no idea that this existed. It was beautifully done, secreted away. We think maybe there's other tarot decks she did. We didn't really know. And so we looked at it and we began to look at other Carrington works, and we realized that the tarot was actually at the core of much of her work. And we had to reanalyze her entire oeuvre. We thought about every single thing, and always it's a surprise. The main card that she personally identified with was the Hanged Man, which I'm showing you here. And it was a perfect card for her, who had been through so much in life, war, escaping to a foreign country, and it kind of represented her liminal state, always hanging between different types of worlds and countries. And I know that this was Niki's favorite card, and I hope Rachel will talk a little bit about that later, the Fool card. And I'm just throwing this in for the wheel, which we'll also see. So we know that Niki was very interested in this particular deck. And Rachel, could you chime in here and tell us a little bit about it?
Okay, this is the oldest known complete tarot. It's missing a couple of cards, but that's about all. And it's from 1450, as we see. It was a wedding present, apparently, for a marriage between the Visconti family and the Sforza family, two royal families. And it was a game. Tarot had just begun, actually. It had just become initiated into European culture. Cards had come from Egypt, and were not ancient Egypt. They came from modern Egypt. Actually, they were the Ottoman, the Turkish mercenaries. Anyway, but so they came into Europe and they immediately caught on. But as a game to play, and also for gambling as well. And then somewhere, somehow, somebody came up with the idea of a more extensive game, primarily it would seem for the upper classes, because you have these beautiful images. And that game would include an extra suit. And this suit would be called Triumphi. And then later became known as tarots. And so the suit enabled artists to come in and do beautiful renditions of metaphorical and allegorical images. So we see, I guess that's looks like the Queen of Swords on the left. On the right is the Wheel of Fortune, a very prominent, important card. And the symbol of the Wheel of Fortune is an example, because in the Middle Ages, that was a very important allegorical image and appeared in many places. And so what's significant about this deck, and perhaps significant also to Niki, was the fact that in the very beginning, tarot was an aspect of fine art. You know, really good artists would do these beautiful pictures. You can't see it too well, but it's actually gold leaf. What looks like brown is gold leaf everywhere. It's a stunning, wonderful deck. Okay, someone's having trouble. Is that better? The mic is too close. Okay. So this deck was a significant deck for her, because it was significant for all tarot history. It was the first one, and it was one done by a very wonderful artist.
Well, you know, I'm sure Carrington saw this too, because her major arcana deck, many of the cards are covered in gold leaf in the background as well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to also add that Niki de Saint Phalle made a series of prints of the major arcana, and she includes this metallic paper in all of them. So it's like a art supply store material, but it's this reflective
Yeah.
material, so also a nod to the alchemical.
It's interesting, one further statement about the Bembo deck, the Conti Sforza. It's not clear if those cards are actually used for playing. They're fairly large, and you could damage them easily because of the gold leaf. I think some of the gold leaf has worn off. It's my theory that they played with a simpler deck, and these were on display, and these were like the reference to the cards in their hands. I don't have any proof of this, but partly because there's no numbers on them and no names. And you can't play a game of cards unless you know what the actual number sequence is, because you don't know which card beats what other card. And it's a very simple matter of card playing. But go on.
All right, so I'm showing two decks that probably many tarot lovers are very familiar with. One is the Rider Waite Smith deck on the left, and the other one
It's on
is,
the right, Susan.
oh, sorry, I'm
Yeah,
reversed here on
yeah,
the
yeah.
right. And on the left is the Thoth deck, the Crowley deck. And I just wanted to remind everyone that these beautiful cards that are in constant use were both created by women. The Crowley deck was Frida Harris, and the other one obviously was Pamela Coleman Smith. And there's been, real recent research into these women artists that we really didn't acknowledge what they did in the tarot. Anything you want to say, Rachel?
Well, these are the two main strands of esoteric interpretation of the tarot, at least in Anglophone countries. In Europe, particularly France and other countries around France, the Marseille deck was for a long time, still to a large extent, thank you, the true one and only tarot according to their traditions. But in England, a magical group called the Order of the Golden Dawn, they took the tarot in a very complex Kabbalistic esoteric tradition. And so the Waite deck with Pamela Smith on the right, the moon card, that's from that deck, and it's more disguised. It has more references to the Marseille deck, although quite a bit has changed. And the esoteric symbolism is much more hidden. In the Frida Harris deck under Aleister Crowley's direction, the Thoth deck, Thoth being the Egyptian god who's said to be the creator of the tarot, um, as you can see, it's much more symbolic, much more allegorical, much more in reference to traditional esoteric teachings. So a lot of people find that deck more difficult, but also they find it more advanced. And I personally am a great fan of Pamela Smith's art, and I think that what she did was truly remarkable because you can go deeper and deeper into the rider cards pretty much forever and still never get to the end of it. It's quite a wonderful thing.
I can't help but think that Niki's work was influenced by the colors
Mm.
of the deck, and also just looking at it visually, how the colors were placed in a block-like way. Do you think so, Rachel?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The formation of the structures has a certain kind of resemblance to the Marseille deck, and the colors, absolutely, the very bright, vivid colors that she loved. She might have gone that direction anyway, but I think that she really was reinforced in it by the Marseille deck, which is a really wonderful thing. No one knows exactly its origin. The earliest known version is in 1650, but there's other older versions leading to it. It's a lot of different versions of the Marseille deck.
Mhm. Well, I just wanted to put it in some kind of a context. The Surrealists were very interested in playing cards. And here we see Man Ray's photograph of Jacqueline Lamba, which he has made into a playing card. And then this is a set of cards that some of these surrealists made while they were waiting to leave Europe at the port of Marseille. And again, they're not really divination cards. They're playing with cards and card forms because the laws of chance were of great interest to them. And I just wanted to put on this great Victor Bronner tarot card called the Lovers, like the tarot card, but actually, Rachel, it incorporates which two cards?
It's the magician, sometimes called the juggler, and the high priestess or the female pope. They're number one and number two, so here they're joined together.
And he was very, very interested in the esoteric. And actually quite a few of his paintings reference the tarot. And then I think it's really important to always mention that the surrealist Kurt Seligman, while he was in New York, did a lot of research into the occult, and in 1948 produces this wonderful book, The Mirror of Magic. And here he is standing in a magic circle introducing the book. And this book had a whole chapter on the tarot. And it was a very big, it was a popular book that many artists owned, and I know that Carrington looked at it extensively for the tarot. And another magical practitioner, an artist and surrealist was Ethel Colquhoun, who also did a tarot deck, although it's certainly not normal, is it, Rachel? It's completely abstract. For example, the card on the left is called the Lord of Earned Success, and the blue one is the Lord of Pleasure, but they are from the 70s.
Those
So,
cards, I just may say something, Susan.
yes,
Those titles are from the Golden Dawn and from Crowley.
and she was a member of the
Yeah.
Golden Dawn,
Yeah.
and I believe the OTO as well, if I understand that. Great. So here is the Niki deck, and in Niki's handwriting, or is a reference to our very own Rachel. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thank you for that. So very helpful to build this context, and also to segue into, Rachel, your experience working with Niki as you were an advisor for the Tarot Garden, and she was embarking on this for over 20 years. She started building the very first constructions in 1980 through 82. And I know you visited her and helped advised her in terms of plotting out the garden. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Yes, yeah. Well, the first I ever heard of it actually was a letter from her. I was living in Amsterdam at the time, and I guess she got my address from my publisher or something. And she wrote to me and she just said she would like me to come advise her, that she was in the middle of this great project, and I guess my work had influenced her, and she wanted very much to have me come and be there and look at it with her and give her some ideas. So she sent me a plane ticket, and I went down there, and there were a few of us staying there at the time, and we just spent some time walking around. She showed me things. She talked about the history of it. She told me some interesting personal things. One of the things that really struck me was, she was living in the Empress statue, this huge Sphinx. And she was living in there, and it seemed like it was a wonderful, adventurous place to live, but also it was a bit difficult because they had to lock the place up at night because it was in the countryside. And so there was a certain fear. She was a well-known person. Obviously, people knew she was wealthy, had wealthy connections. And so they were just a little afraid that, that she could be kidnapped, because that was happening at that time in Italy, in the countryside. So it was strange for her. During the day, there'd be people around, the work people, guests, we'd all be spending time together. And at night, she'd go inside, lock herself in the Sphinx, and then the gate would be locked. So it was a bit difficult for her. We talked a little bit about that, about how to get past that and how to keep the sense of play that was so important to her. One of the things I love about her work, and all her work, but the Tarot Garden especially, is you can see the sense of play in it everywhere. And so it's a lovely thing to witness and to be with her there to do it. It was fairly unfinished at that point. I don't remember how many statues were done. Some were in process still, not like half done or so. The Justice statue, I guess it was Justice. Yes, that was. It's huge. It towers over trees, and but it was unfinished. In some ways, I like that better in that version because the legs, there was a space between the legs. You could walk through Justice to the other side. Later on, she built a mechanism in there. She was fond of working with Jean Tingley, her partner, on machines, and he did the fountain in front of the very first thing you saw. So that became Within the Legs of Justice, which had a great deal of meaning, but it was nice that you could walk through justice in the early stages. So one of the things we did that was very interesting, she wanted me to do a reading about it. And I think that she might have assumed I would just, take a set of cards and then just ask the cards, what do you want to know about the statues? But instead I said, well, let's use the statues as a reading. So we walked around and looked at all the statues, and then she drew a map of the site and where all the statues were at that point, And so that was a large enough piece of paper that we could put cards on top of it. So what we did for a reading was to shuffle a set of cards. I forget which deck we used at the time, and then lay the cards out on top of the statue. So, for instance, the Empress might transform into the Emperor because the Emperor card might be the card that we lay on top of it. We use only the so-called major arcana, the 22 extra cards or trump cards, because that's the only part of the tarot she worked with was the major arcana. And so we saw how the cards could transform from one thing to another by doing a reading, which really fascinated her. She really liked the idea a lot. Go on.
Did she change the structures based on the reading? Any of them?
I don't think so. My memory is that she did not change. She had the layout where she wanted it to be, which was determined obviously by the geography of the site to some extent, the topography. So, so she had a clear mind what she wanted to be. I think it gave her an understanding, though, not just of the cards that she was creating in the statues, but also the fluidity of the whole process. Even though they would be fixed in their place, nevertheless, there would be a sense that they could move in certain sense, And then of course she made cards of them, and I don't know. I didn't see her by the time she had done that, so I don't know if she ever tried using a kind of map of the site and putting the cards on top of it. I actually suggested to her at one point that she could have her son, who was a very accomplished photographer, go up in a helicopter and take an overall large photograph of the site with all the statues on it, which could then be made into a kind of game board. And then you could take her cards and mix them, and you could do what we did originally, was to see the transformations. See what card would end up on the Fool, what card would end up on the Empress, and so on, which would be interesting. But she didn't choose to do that. But we have the cards, so all that's needed really is for someone to do a large map of the site, and maybe that's, I don't know, is that at Garvico, at the site at the garden? Does anyone know? Does anyone do a map of it?
There's aerial photography of it at this point, and you can see where everything is, but I haven't seen, I'm sure there's a map too, but I think it's more the photography. And I mean, it's interesting because she took all of these, the 22 major arcana, and turned them into these, icons, even though they already are these like archetypes and icons. And she used them, to make the structures, but also to make the cards, to make prints. So they sort of, and there's models as well, which are featured in the exhibition. So, she made many variations of them, but it's interesting to think about her working in this way in which she's taking cards that are mobile and making them like set into the landscape and these built structures where the viewer, the person like walks through them and you encounter them in a certain order and you sort of interpret them. And that just leads me to thinking about narrative and the role of narrative and tarot, and also, noting that both Leonora Carrington and Niki de Saint Phalle were writers too, and writing was a really important part of their work, and fairy tales and sort of these mechanisms of narrative and storytelling and archetypes. And I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit in terms of how, your response to that, but also Susan too, about Leonora Carrington's, relationship to, what these kinds of archetypes and narratives mean and what they can do.
What's interesting to me about that is the playfulness of the statues. A lot of her other work, obviously, too, but so much in the statues that sort of, that childlike energy, that joyous energy that's always bursting forth. Even something like the Devil, which would be, a fearsome card, and the Death card. So that has that childlike, it has a fairy tale kind of quality that I think was always so important to her. Remember, she told me once that she couldn't draw perspective. She couldn't draw in the traditional, art history kind of way. She said that people taught her 2 or 3 times. Someone had taught her, and she said she immediately forgot. She would learn it and then immediately forget it. And I think it was deliberate. I think she wanted to keep the childlike quality and didn't want to take on any other sort of grown-up kind of quality of traditional art perspective. So I think that's the sense that I have. And Susan, you want to say something about Carrington?
Well, I think that's such an interesting question. And Carrington was very interested in the narrative possibilities of the theater. So during the research for the Carrington book on the tarot, Tere and I found in some archives photographs of work she did with Octavio Paz on his rendition of Rappaccini's daughter, Nathaniel
Mm,
Hawthorne story. And the play opens with the character of the fool. And the fool is kind of helps the narrative along. And then a little bit later on, she also did a play. This time it was her play, Penelope, and Alejandro Jodorowsky
mm,
was the person who kind of put it together. And she did the costumes and the stage sets, and they all had tarot imagery. So you're correct. And in short stories, figures flutter in and out that do represent the tarot.
Well, and it's also like this personal narrative, which Niki is often using, but then making it this, trying to make it universal or archetypal, or sort of these, playing with also moralistic tales, which I think is another facet of tarot that's really interesting, is this relationship to meaning, and playing with these dichotomies and contradictions, like positive and negative, good and bad. And Niki de Saint Phalle in her tarot garden, it's been noted, and it's obvious in many of her works, that she's dealing primarily with the female form, super femme aesthetic, and replacing many figures that are often depicted as masculine as feminine, and playing with that kind of these kinds of dichotomies, and how the tarot itself is a tool for kind of like flipping meaning and changing a sort of idea of the moralistic tale, I guess, that maybe fairy tales also contain. I don't know if that like she's the tree of life in the tarot garden. One half of it is black and white and is like sort of negative, and the other side is all color and has like positive things in it. So she's sort of playing with those dichotomies constantly.
That has a very occult meaning, because in the occult tradition, the tree of life is a kind of shadow tree, a tree of darkness, tree of death, sometimes people say. And that's often seen in the most negative way as evil and something to banish. So by combining the two, she is, going past that polarity thing, which it strikes me, one of the first things that you see when you go in, and one of the very first statues that she did was the magician high priestess. And this is a very strong statement, because the magician card number 1 and the high priestess card number 2 are the archetypal male and female energies. Even more than the empress and the emperor, who are more social presentation. It's like yin and yang, high priestess and the magician. Pure, like, darkness and light and so on. And so by combining them into a single statue, she was making a strong statement of getting beyond that limitation, getting beyond that polarity, and then opening up into the idea of what can we do if we bring energies together. Plus, what was great about that is you went inside it. You go inside, you climb up into the top of the statue and look out the eye, I think it was. And so, you became part of it immediately. So right in the front of the garden, when you came into it, you just immediately joined in. You immediately became part of the whole presentation by climbing up inside the statue. I don't know now that it's open to the public if that's still possible for people to do. They might have, because you don't want to take chances sometimes, but definitely was one of the process. That was the main feature of it, to go inside and climb up and look out the window of I guess it's the magician on top of the high priestess. And so you're seeing the magical point of view from up high.
Carrington used to say, or she said, she didn't use the tarot for divination. She would say the tarot is a mirror. And I thought that was really interesting when I think of, didn't some of the statues in the tarot garden, weren't some of the interiors mirrored?
The
Were they,
outside too.
and the outside?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, mirrors first, but they were not. They were little fragments of mirrors, like a mosaic of mirrors. So there was not a whole single pane of mirror that you could look at yourself in one form. So what you would see looking at them was fragments.
And that is a quote she used from a magical text,
Mm,
that it's a many faceted mirror.
yes.
And I
Yeah.
think so, that I wonder if that was part of Niki's idea.
Mm. I love those from the very beginning, the moment I saw them, because to me, the concept of play is vital to the tarot. I find it very difficult that so many people get so serious. They get serious at the ultimate meaning, these cosmic explanations and these rules and to my mind, somewhat rigid forms of what the tarot is supposed to be. And they they'll sometimes dismiss the idea that they're playing cards. They'll see it as an insult. I mean, Waite, I think, referred to using the tarot for divination as the history of a long insult. That's how he put it. But to me, the essence of them is that they're a game. And we play with them, and that opens us up to other dimensions, opens us up to knowledge of ourselves, knowledge of the universe. So I love that she has that quality. From the moment I walked in the gate, it just struck me. I was so thrilled to see that, and told her, and that's part of what she aimed for.
I just wanted to read a quote of Niki talking about the tarot, and she says, "If life is a game of cards, we are born without knowing the rules, yet we must play our hand. Throughout the ages, people have liked playing with tarot cards. Poets, philosophers, alchemists, artists have devoted themselves to discovering their meaning."
Here's something interesting about that, actually. So we don't know exactly when tarot cards became used for divination, for telling fortunes. We do know exactly when they became declared an occult esoteric tradition. That was in 1881 by a French scholar, and he was producing this grand work, Le Monde Primitif, the primitive world, which in that time, the primitive world didn't mean savage and undeveloped. It actually meant superior, like Atlantis. Because at that time, really until the modern idea of progress, people believed the further back you went, the better it was. And our world was a corrupt version of the primitive world. And he declared in that book, in volume 8 actually of 9 volumes, that the tarot was ancient Egyptian teachings. And then it just completely took off from there immediately. It just was like an explosion of intense esoteric energy all around the tarot. But we do know that fortune telling from his statement came not long afterwards. We don't know if it was done before that. Maybe people were using the cards. I suspect they were, because anything you can play with, you can do fortunes with. So it would seem like hard to believe that the fortune tellers would not be using tarot cards for fortune telling. But we do know the original use of it besides for a card game and art was poetry. Because very early on, I think it might have been the Bembo cards, I'm not sure. People at one of the courts would have the cards, and then someone would come and make up a satirical, gentle poem about someone in the court. It would be officially about a card, the high priestess, for example, the female pope, But people would then know it was about Madame so-and-so. And similarly with some of the male cards as well. Let's say, it would be gently satirical. So it always fascinates me that the first use of tarot beyond playing cards was poetry, was art. Beautiful works of art and then poetry inspired by the art. And a great figure of tarot in the 20th century, Italo Calvino, gave a great definition of tarot. He said it's a machine for constructing stories. And he was very fascinated by this. I don't know if he was involved with the surrealists, he was involved with a similar group of experimental literary work. But I think he actually constructed a kind of machine, a kind of, device, which all the cards were attached to. He was so he was so struck by this idea. So the tarot has always been involved with art and literature, as well as divination and occult traditions.
I love what you said, Rachel, about anything you can play with, you can do.
Absolutely. And many things you can't play a game with. You know, in ancient Rome, they had a divination system looking at the poop of sacred chickens from the temple. Isn't that wonderful? Anything at all anything that produces random bits of something, you can apply meaning to and symbols to, and get divination meanings from.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the shifting meaning of tarot in the 20th century, particularly, you know, in art, but also in mainstream culture. And Susan, you talked a little bit about surrealism, but you know, at the time that Niki de Saint Phalle is embarking on the tarot garden in the, you know, she starts thinking about it in the 70s, and she finds the land that she's going to build it on in the late 70s. And then she's also making a lot of sculptures of fantastic, like models of fantastic architecture. So she's not sure yet it's going to be a tarot garden. She's thinking of this like fantastic architectural new matriarchal society. Like she's really trying out a lot of ideas of what this park could be after Gaudi's Park Güell, but to outdo Gaudi, which she did in the end. And as you mentioned, like the Empress she lived in, there's plumbing in some of these structures, they're inhabitable. You know, she lived there for 7 years until the entire like mirror mosaic came up, and she just couldn't take it anymore because I think it must be challenging. But the kitchen's covered in it, it's like every surface. Yeah. But at the time, like in the late 70s, early 80s, when she's starting to embark on the tarot garden, I don't know if Susan and Rachel, if you could speak a little bit to that cultural moment in terms of mainstream culture and tarot, but also how it shifts in art too, if you have any anecdotes or stories about that.
I'll just start by saying that there was a lot of interest in tarot culturally, but not so much in what you might call like establishment art culture. It was more like the hippies and some of the radicals and some other people who were doing experimental work. Less interest in, you know, sort of fine art approaches to tarot. And that's changed over time. The first person to really do something like that was Salvador Dali, who did a tarot, a full 78-card tarot deck. And I actually wrote the first book about that, the only book about that for quite some years. And so I got to know that deck fairly well. And now it's quite different because now there's a lot of things going on. And you see tarot described now in the articles in the New York Times, New Yorker, various other magazines that previously would be totally dismissive of the tarot. They would just see it as nonsense, as trash. So there's a whole big shift that's occurred. Susan, do you want to say something about that movement?
I agree with you totally. I do think that whenever there are cultural times of great change, there is a revival of interest in the occult. And the seismic shift of the 60s, I think, ushered in this interest. And I think tarot decks were widely distributed. I always think of the 1970 multi-volume set of Man, Myth, and Magic that was produced, I think, by a mainstream publisher, and how it entered into popular culture. Maybe not art world culture, but definitely.
Susan, that wasn't Time Life, was it?
Yeah, it was Time Life. It was
amazing. Time magazine.
Volumes, and it was actually really good. It was written by Richard Cavendish.
Oh, really? Wow.
It was amazing, and it had a lot of art in it. It was all art. And, you know, I guess you could link it to Man and His Symbols, the Jung book that came out. But and so now it's a time of great seismic changes as well. So it kind of makes sense that there's a new interest in the tarot. What do you think, Rachel?
Well, I think part of what spurred it is the internet, because the internet allows for so many videos of people doing tarot to take off and get lots of attention, and also crowdfunding. So you can have tarot decks that are made by really dedicated artists that do not need to have a lot of money to get published. Previously, for tarot to get published, it had to be published by a big publisher, and they were always playing safe and trying to reach the widest possible audience, so they would not do anything interesting artistically, or not often. So now you have, you just raise a few $1,000s, you produce a tarot deck to your design, to what you want to do, and people fund it and people back it. So I think that's been an explosion. That's been a great advantage. And now there's also on YouTube, there are many, many tarot readers who take a psychic approach. They kind of talk about their guides and their spiritual messages. But there's another way to have tarot become part of people's lives. Because they're talking about actually about current events. And mostly what they talk about is politics. Will Trump get convicted? Will there be a crisis at the border? Things like that. So that brings it into the mainstream as well. It's being used for mainstream subjects.
That makes me want to ask you two questions, but I'll ask the one first and then the second one. But just the relationship between tarot and the occult and politics, I guess, looking at the 20th century, like in these moments of crisis, or how tarot operates as a way to make sense of things that maybe don't make sense. But just if you have any thoughts on the relationship between tarot and politics, and of course, I think this relates to Carrington as well.
Yeah, Sis, why don't you talk a bit about that? Because you know more about the surrealists who were more involved with the political movements of their time.
Well,
Were they using tarot for that at all, or?
Yes and no. Well, during World War II, when it became apparent that there was no rationality whatsoever, particularly after the photographs from the interiors of concentration camps came out late in the early 40s, the surrealists made a real turn towards occultism and magic, realizing that logic does not apply and you can't fight evil of society logically. And so they became very entrenched in the occult. And when they returned to France, leaving New York City after the war was over, they did several shows that focused on magic, but Europe really didn't want that. They were exhausted from the irrationality of the war, and they moved away from it. And of course, in New York City, the art world turned towards abstract expressionism. So I don't know if I answered your question, Ruba, but there's my 2 cents.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think it's I think it's interesting to think of how the tarot is used to I think to what Rachel was saying earlier too, for like satire or hidden meaning, or ways to talk about things that are perhaps difficult to take head on as well. So it's like a way of thinking about things indirectly, perhaps, as well as directly. And that just leads me to another question, I guess, in terms.
Can I just say one more thing before you do that? So one thing that really strikes me is that the revival of interest in the world beyond just the narrow world of occultists came from a book in France that was a head-on attack, in a certain sense, of the existentialist strain of philosophical approach and rational approach. And this was called The Morning of the Magicians. I don't know what the French title was. It was about the Order of the Golden Dawn, to which Waite and Crowley were both members. So it's interesting that movement started in France and then came back, in a sense, to the Anglo-Saxon countries. So, thank you.
Thank you for adding that. And I guess I also wanted to ask about making one's own deck, and there's a couple of reasons. And I think just starting with Niki de Saint Phalle, when she starts working on the tarot garden, she's working on it for over 20 years, and it opens to the public in 1998. But in a lot of interviews and material where she's speaking about the tarot garden, she doesn't really explain it or talk about it that much. It's almost like a kind of secret, right? She says, "Oh, I have this garden, the sculpture park I'm working on." And even though it's her biggest work and the one she spent the most time on, it's also not seen as like her, you know, as part of her oeuvre in this way. Like it's something that seems outside of her, even though it's the most, I think, arguably like connected to who she was and what she was doing. But it was also sort of this like hiding in plain sight, or this the sort of secretiveness around something that's enormously public, and visited by the public, but then becomes something that's beyond her, right? Because she's also said on numerous occasions, like, it's for the people, it's not my garden, it's for those who are experiencing it. So she makes something that also, you know, takes on a life of its own. And so with that background, just thinking about what it means to make your own deck. And Rachel, of course, you've made decks of, and Susan, you know, Lenora Carrington's deck was hidden and no one knew about it, I guess, or some people maybe knew about it, but it wasn't something that was very known. She, you know, maybe one friend knew, maybe, but yeah. So that's sort of the secretiveness of the deck, and what it really mean, you know, from a historical perspective in relation to Carrington, but also Rachel practically, like what it means to do something like that.
Well, I'll stop it because Niki was actually instrumental in me doing my own deck. What happened was I had decided to do a tarot deck, but not being an artist, I thought the standard thing to do was just hire an artist to do the pictures. And I would say what they would be, and the artist would fulfill the image. And I tried a couple of people, and it didn't work out. And people understandably want to do their own pictures, not what I would direct them to do. And so that didn't work out. But meanwhile, I'd been sketching the images to show to artists what they would use as a basis for their pictures. And then I met Niki in Paris, and I met her because she wanted a reading from me. And we got together, and then I showed her these little cards I had, you know. And I said, I'm looking for an artist. She said, oh, you must do it yourself, she said. So, well, okay, if Niki de Saint Phalle tells me I should do it myself, and I certainly should. So I started designing the cards more carefully and drawing them much more carefully, and ended up being pretty satisfied with them. They're called the Shining Tribe deck, originally Shining Woman. I changed the name when there was a second edition, probably the second edition, but also because people thought it was only for women. But it was such a strange and sexist idea. If the word woman's in the title, that means it's only for women. But so I credit her very much with, you know, helping me do it. And I want to just very quickly, I drew a couple of cards, just cut the deck to see what cards for this discussion. And they're wonderful because both of them are involved with cooperative activity and making things real. So this card is called the Three of Trees. And it's the idea, these are actually things you can make. They're actually creations done in Canada by the native people there. And so this was the idea of making something, not just in your head, not just on paper, but actually constructing something, just as she constructed the cards as statues and buildings and towering, you know, beautiful presentations. And the second one is called the Eight of Rivers, and this is about collective dreaming and collective fantasies. It's inspired by African dance rituals and African costumes. And it's the idea of people doing things together and people leaving behind the ordinary daily life and merging into a fantasy world, into a spiritual world. And those things seem so perfectly attuned to, you know, what she was doing and the way her work affected other people. So I just wanted to share that aspect of it. Susan, do you want to say something about
What
that?
can I say after that, Rachel?
Oh.
Really. Rachel, do you have any other kind of stories about her that you'd like to share?
Well, yeah, yes, this is quite a powerful story. It involves that time in Paris together. I can't remember how that came to be. It might have been that she wrote me and said that she was going to be in Paris and could I come there because she really needed a reading from me. She was having some really difficult issues. And so it was the kind of thing, you know, when Niki de Saint Phalle says, can you come, you come, you know. So, and I was living in Amsterdam, it was just a train ride, and I would use any excuse to go to Paris because I loved Paris. And I went to Paris and met her in this gorgeous apartment by a woman named Marina Corella, who's an artist, who I ended up doing a book with. She had done these beautiful cards for a fortune teller named Madame Yagel Didier. and they're called Le Jeu divinatoire de Madame Yagal Divide. You know, the divinatory game, because in Europe it's always a game. Tarot is always called a game, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, but so we did a reading. The issue that she had was, this was really disturbing her. She was working on the death statue, and her partner, John Tingley, was very, very ill, and she was afraid he would die, and it was because she had worked on the death statue. And more generally, she felt that the cards were becoming too powerful, the statues, that they were overwhelming her, and she was having trouble dealing with it because she was, living every day and every night by herself in this huge structure, this huge set of incredibly powerful statues. And so we did a reading, and what came up in the reading, I forget the cards to be honest, but what came up was the idea that she had to let go of seeing them as her creation. She had to let them be independent beings and not see herself as in charge of them in any way. So in that sense, she would no longer feel that it all depended on her and that people's lives depended on her. And she, by setting them free, she set herself free. She was so relieved at that. She's so happy to get that message. She really took it to heart. But then what happened was, and next time I went to Italy, which is the last time I saw her, I think, except once in New York. But what happened was that one day, Jean Tingley recovered, he was fine, but then the foreman at the place with whom she worked very closely, of course, for so many years, he fell down dead. He died of a heart attack on site. It was a horrible, horrible thing, And she ended up making at that place they had not a lot of land for graves and cemeteries. So there would be these drawers that people's remains would be in, and the drawers would have decorations on them. She decorated this drawer for the family. It's a magnificent work of art. I wonder if there's a photograph of it anywhere. It was such a beautifully touching thing to do, and I'm going to assume they appreciated it and didn't blame her in any way for his death. But it was, so that was what came of that. It was the power of the tarot, that thing about setting it free though is so important to her. She felt so happy by it.
Well, so it's so interesting to thank you for sharing that. And it's also like the tarot is, isn't it representing, like each card's representing like a cycle of life or sort of like a period. It was interesting, like in that she was moving through these different structures and making them, she was sort of like taking on that card, whichever one she was working on, as well. And Susan, I don't know if you want to speak to Leonora Carrington too, because I do find it interesting, this connection between the sort of production of a deck that is not widely known or publicly available, and in fact secret and hidden, and just if you have any thoughts on that in relation to this idea of the power of the deck perhaps. But yeah, any thoughts in terms of like why Carrington kept this deck hidden?
I wonder that too. I've been wondering that ever since we first saw it.
Well, that's one of the most wonderful things about her that I respect so much, is that I was interviewing artists and people who knew her very well, and they told me that she talked about the tarot all the time. It's all the time, in every detail. But
Wow.
nobody knew that she made her own deck. And it's a very strange deck. It's almost square instead of the usual rectangle. And my theory is only 2 of the cards are dated to 1955. And my theory is she used them in a very similar way, Rachel, that occultists create their own magical implements. I think she made it and meditated on it very strongly. So I think they were for her instruments of self-knowledge in private, not meant for the commercial world. That's what I think.
Do you think she concealed it because she would be pressured to publish it if she let people know about it? Do you think that was going on?
I think, well, I don't know for sure, but at the time, she made them in the 50s, right? She was not very popular. People already thought her work was too occult and they called it childish and fairy tale like. So maybe she was afraid it would further
Yeah.
damage her career,
Yeah.
actually.
Mhm. But I know that you've identified some of the tarot images in her paintings. They kind of snuck in secretly into her paintings.
I think they were always there. It's just
Uh-huh.
I never saw it.
Yeah.
And I've looked at them thousands of times, and then all of a sudden it was like a light bulb.
Wow.
Sorry, we're getting off target here.
No, no. Well, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, just what you said about Carrington, you know, Niki de Saint Phalle and Carrington were very different artists, but connected in some ways as well in terms of like this kind of independence that they had, as well as a sort of outsider status at times, not participating in a more mainstream art world even, and looking at different sources. And I think that's a really interesting connection because, you know, Niki de Saint Phalle, Leonora Carrington were incorporating and looking at histories, different sources, different modes of inspiration that many that weren't necessarily popular or taken seriously in a more mainstream art world.
And don't forget, they were both radical feminists.
Right.
You know, that was I think, the key to their lives, wouldn't you say, Rachel?
For Niki, I don't know much about Carrington, but Niki for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Carrington, for sure.
Well, and you said something, Susan, the other day, which was, you know, also Niki de Saint Phalle's aesthetic, which was a sort of very femme, colorful aesthetic that was meant to, you know, assault the senses. And just how, I don't remember exactly how you put it, but you had a nice way of capturing her not as these giant women that she was, you know, she's these giant female forms that she was making starting in the 60s, that you can see again in the Tarot Garden as well. And thinking of the female form, you know, as also a house, as a space that has an interior as well, which she also incorporates in Tarot Garden, but other projects that she was doing.
I like it. It's a multifaceted attack on patriarchy. She creates these all-encompassing large female figures, and Carrington makes very ethereal women that kind of slip through the cracks into other realms. So they have both fronts there.
You know, it's interesting one of the things I learned from Niki was her early work, when she did the rifles and the shooting at, you know, kind of effigies that filled with red paint like blood. And she had video in that time in New York when I went to see her. And it was just so wonderful to watch because her face was so ecstatic. She was, you know, probably shooting her father, if we're going to be honest, and blood was pouring out. But then she changed that to her radical feminism became much more positive, became not just overthrowing patriarchy, but creating matriarchy in the most positive sense of the word. In those beautiful nanas, the gorgeous statues, and then the Tarot Garden, which was just joy. It wasn't, you know, nothing aggressive. And yet it was radical feminism of joy, which is the most wonderful thing.
Yeah, and that was Carrington too, creating a world without hierarchy according to gender and even according to different life forms. So I think that was part of her feminist project. It's the utopian world.
Yeah.
That's like a very strong connection between the two. And also tarot, which is, you know, there is an order, but it's the way that you play it happens in a non-hierarchical way, right? I mean, the order is constantly changing. It's always in flux. The power relationship is always changing.
Nice.
I'm imagining a movie now in which a young Niki de Saint Phalle meets an aging Leonora Carrington. And you know what that would be like, what that encounter might be like.
They weren't too far apart in age.
Well, when did Niki die? When did Leonora Carrington die again, Susan?
2011.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was much earlier. No, they weren't apart at all. Then, then it would be very possible for them to meet, for sure. I didn't realize.
She was born in 1930, and Leonora was 1917.
Okay, yeah. So now someone should do that and make a beautiful play and movie, you know?
Right.
And they could have, maybe they met. We don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know.
maybe they did. Yeah, exactly.
No idea. That would be amazing. But they met through this conversation at least, which I really appreciate. And, you know, I think we've had a really wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate your time and your stories and your knowledge. It's just incredible to hear. So thank you so much, Susan and Rachel, for this
Thank you.
conversation. And yeah, I hope to see you soon,
Yes.
IRL.
Thank you for
Yeah.
doing this important exhibition. I
Yes.
couldn't even believe it when I heard about it. I was so excited. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And good night. And thank you everyone for joining us and for your attention. And yeah, come to PS1 and see the show. Thank you. Good night.